They called them the Forgotten Army. While Montgomery basked in glory and Alexander received accolades, Canadian soldiers fought and died in battles that would reshape the course of World War II. Armed with aging tanks, improvised weapons, and a determination born from being constantly overlooked, these men would achieve what many thought impossible. They would kill or capture 80,000 enemy soldiers. Yet history barely remembers their names. This is the story of how the most underestimated force in the Allied army became its most lethal weapon. This is the story of insult, innovation, and an unprecedented body count that shocked even the Germans. Before we dive into this incredible tale of courage and ingenuity, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. And after you hear this story, leave a comment telling us which aspect of Canadian military history surprises you most. Now let's begin. The winter of 1943 was brutal. Snow fell across the Italian countryside like a white shroud covering the dead. And there were many dead. The Italian campaign had turned into a meat grinder, consuming lives at an alarming rate. American, British, and Canadian forces pushed northward against fierce German resistance. Every hill, every river, every town became a battlefield soaked in blood. But within this larger narrative of suffering and sacrifice, one group of soldiers faced a unique burden. The Canadians weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting for recognition, for respect, for acknowledgement that they even existed. And their commanding officers, the very men who should have championed their cause, treated them like second-class citizens in their own army. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the celebrated hero of El Alamein, had a particular disdain for colonial forces. He viewed them as inferior to his beloved British divisions. When planning operations, he consistently assigned the Canadians to secondary roles, supporting positions, or what he considered minor objectives. In his mind, the real fighting would be done by proper British soldiers. General Harold Alexander, Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Italy, shared this prejudice. When medals and commendations were distributed, Canadian units were routinely passed over. When reporters came to document Allied victories, they were directed to British units, even when Canadians had done the heavy lifting. When strategic planning sessions occurred, Canadian commanders found themselves excluded or ignored. This wasn't just insulting. It was strategically incompetent. The Canadian Army in Italy represented some of the finest soldiers the Allies had. They had trained rigorously. They had combat experience from Dieppe, from Sicily, from the early Italian battles. They had proven themselves time and again. Yet Montgomery and Alexander treated them like an inconvenient afterthought. The insults were both subtle and blatant. During one planning meeting, Montgomery literally turned his back on a Canadian general who was trying to contribute to the tactical discussion. Another time, Alexander referred to Canadian troops as colonials, who needed British guidance to be effective in combat. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic pattern of disrespect that poisoned the relationship between British High Command and their Canadian counterparts. But the Canadians weren't asking for respect. They were going to earn it. In blood. In German blood. The Canadian First Corps consisted of roughly 90,000 men. They included infantry divisions, armored units, artillery battalions, and support personnel. These soldiers came from every corner of Canada. Farm boys from Saskatchewan, factory workers from Ontario, fishermen from Nova Scotia, loggers from British Columbia. They spoke English and French. They came from cities and wilderness. They represented the mosaic of a young nation eager to prove itself on the world stage. Their equipment told a different story. While British units received the newest tanks, the Canadians made do with older models. Their Sherman tanks were reliable but outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers. Their artillery pieces were effective but fewer in number than what British divisions received. Their supply lines were longer, their rations smaller, their medical facilities more rudimentary. And this is where the ingenuity began. Canadian soldiers, accustomed to making do with less, began innovating. They modified their tanks, adding extra armor plates scavenged from destroyed German vehicles. They created improvised weapons, fashioning explosives from captured German ammunition and Canadian engineering know-how. They developed new tactics, combining infantry and armor in ways that caught the Germans completely off guard. In the workshops behind the front lines, Canadian mechanics and engineers worked miracles. They welded metal plates onto tank hulls to provide better protection against German anti-tank weapons. They mounted additional machine guns on vehicles that weren't designed to carry them. They created mobile artillery platforms from captured enemy equipment. They fashioned flamethrowers, grenade launchers, and other weapons that weren't in any official army manual. But the most impressive innovation was tactical. Canadian commanders, frustrated by their exclusion from high-level planning, began developing their own approaches to warfare. They studied German defensive patterns. They analyzed terrain more carefully than British staff officers did. They listened to their soldiers, incorporating frontline experience into operational planning. They took risks that more cautious British commanders would never approve. This combination of resourcefulness and tactical innovation would prove devastating. The Germans were about to learn a hard lesson about underestimating the Canadians. The Gothic line represented the last major German defensive position in northern Italy. Stretching across the Italian peninsula from coast to coast, it incorporated natural obstacles like mountains and rivers with man-made fortifications including concrete bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, and carefully positioned artillery. The Germans had spent months preparing these defenses. They believed the position was virtually impregnable. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had good reason for confidence. His forces had demonstrated repeatedly that they could hold defensive positions against numerically superior Allied forces. The mountainous Italian terrain favored the defender. Every ridge line, every river valley, every narrow pass could be turned into a killing ground. The Gothic line was designed to bleed the Allies white, to make them pay such a heavy price for every meter of ground that they would lose the will to continue. Montgomery's plan for breaking the Gothic line was predictably conservative and predictably British-centered. He would launch a massive frontal assault with his British divisions while the Americans attacked from the west. The Canadians were assigned a supporting role on the Adriatic coast, where Montgomery believed the terrain was unsuitable for major operations. What Montgomery didn't know was that Canadian commanders had already identified the Adriatic sector as a potential breakthrough point. While British intelligence dismissed the coastal route as too difficult, Canadian reconnaissance teams had found weaknesses in the German defenses. They had mapped out routes through supposedly impassable terrain. They had identified poorly defended sectors where a concentrated assault could penetrate the German lines. Canadian General Tommy Burns understood what his British superiors did not. This wasn't about following conventional wisdom. This was about exploiting specific opportunities that required speed, aggression, and tactical flexibility. Burns knew his men could deliver all three. The operation began on August 25, 1944. While British forces launched their expected frontal assault further west, Canadian units began their advance along the Adriatic coast. The Germans, focused on the main British attack, initially paid little attention to what they assumed was a minor supporting action. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Canadian infantry moved forward under cover of darkness, infiltrating German positions before the enemy even knew they were there. Combat engineers cleared paths through minefields using techniques they had developed through bitter experience. Tank crews pushed their aging Shermans forward with a speed and coordination that shocked German defenders. Artillery units provided devastating supporting fire, having calculated trajectories and timing with mathematical precision. The initial breakthrough came faster than anyone expected. Canadian troops punched through the first German defensive line within hours. By dawn, they were already engaging the second line of fortifications. German commanders scrambled to respond, rushing reinforcements to a sector they had considered relatively safe. But the Canadians weren't finished. They were just getting started. And they were about to demonstrate a level of sustained offensive capability that would terrify the German high command. Make sure you stay with us because what happens next is one of the most remarkable military achievements of the entire war. If you're finding this story compelling, hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell us what you think about the Canadian contribution to World War II. Now let's continue. The fighting along the Adriatic coast became a nightmare for German forces. Canadian units didn't just break through the Gothic line. They shattered it. Day after day, week after week, they maintained an offensive tempo that gave the Germans no time to reorganize or establish new defensive positions. This wasn't the slow, grinding warfare that characterized much of the Italian campaign. This was rapid, aggressive, relentless assault that left German units reeling. The key to Canadian success was their combined arms approach. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers worked together with a coordination that came from constant training and hard-won experience. When Canadian tanks encountered strong German defensive positions, infantry would maneuver to flank them while artillery pounded them from above. When infantry met resistance, tanks would provide mobile fire support while engineers prepared explosive charges to destroy fortifications. German defenders found themselves facing tactics they hadn't encountered before. Canadian units would attack at night, infiltrating German positions in the darkness. They would use smoke screens to mask their movements, appearing suddenly where Germans least expected them. They would feint attacks in one direction while launching the real assault elsewhere. They combined conventional military tactics with improvisation and audacity that kept German commanders constantly off balance. The improvised weapons Canadian soldiers had created proved devastatingly effective. Homemade shaped charges destroyed German bunkers that were supposed to be impervious to attack. Modified tanks with extra armor and firepower engaged German Panthers on more equal terms. Flamethrowers fashioned from captured equipment cleared German strongpoints that would have cost dozens of lives to take by conventional assault. But it wasn't just the weapons or the tactics. It was the men wielding them. Canadian soldiers fought with a ferocity born from being constantly underestimated and underappreciated. Every objective they took, every German position they overran, every enemy soldier they killed or captured was proof that Montgomery and Alexander were wrong. These weren't second-rate colonial troops. These were elite warriors who could match any unit in the Allied or German armies. The Germans began to fear Canadian units. Prisoners reported that being assigned to face the Canadians was considered a death sentence. German officers who had fought against the British found themselves unprepared for the speed and aggression of Canadian assaults. Intelligence reports flowing back to German high command painted a disturbing picture of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Town after town fell to the Canadian advance. Rimini, a key German strongpoint, fell after fierce fighting. The Canadians pushed across the Marecchia River, then the USO River, then river after river, each one supposedly a natural barrier that would slow the Allied advance. But the Canadians weren't slowing down. If anything, they were accelerating. German casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Entire battalions were destroyed or captured. Defensive positions that were supposed to hold for weeks fell in days. The carefully constructed German defensive system in the Adriatic sector collapsed under Canadian hammer blows. Kesselring was forced to divert troops from other sectors to try to stop the Canadian juggernaut, weakening his defenses elsewhere. Meanwhile, Montgomery's main assault in the Central Mountains had bogged down. British forces were making minimal progress against strong German resistance. The operation that was supposed to be the primary effort was failing. The supporting attack that Montgomery had dismissed as relatively unimportant was becoming the breakthrough that could win the entire Italian campaign. And Montgomery couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. In his reports to Allied High Command, he consistently downplayed Canadian achievements, attributing successes to Allied forces, without specifically mentioning the Canadians. When he did mention them, it was always in the context of British operational planning and British command decisions. The narrative was always the same. British brilliance was winning the war, with colonial troops playing a supporting role. But the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. British troops fighting alongside the Canadians saw their courage and effectiveness firsthand. American units coordinating with Canadian forces recognized their tactical skill. Even German prisoners, when questioned, spoke of the Canadians with grudging respect and obvious fear. The only people who seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge Canadian excellence were the British generals commanding them. This institutional blindness wasn't just insulting. It was dangerous. Montgomery's refusal to properly support the Canadian offensive meant they fought with fewer resources than they needed. His failure to reinforce success meant opportunities were missed. His determination to maintain the fiction that British forces were doing the heavy lifting meant that the strategic potential of the Canadian breakthrough wasn't fully exploited. The Canadians kept fighting anyway. Not for Montgomery. Not for Alexander. For each other. For Canada. For the simple, brutal satisfaction of proving wrong everyone who had ever underestimated them. By late September, Canadian forces had advanced over 100 kilometers, destroying numerous German divisions and capturing thousands of prisoners. The body count was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested the Canadians had killed or wounded over 30,000 German soldiers and captured another 20,000. And they weren't done. Not even close. The autumn rains came early that year, turning Italian roads into rivers of mud. The offensive ground to a halt as weather made further advances impossible. Both sides dug in, preparing for the winter. German forces used the respite to rebuild their shattered formations and establish new defensive lines. Allied forces rested, resupplied, and prepared for the spring offensive. During the winter months, the stark reality of Canadian achievements became impossible to ignore. Staff officers tallying casualty figures and analyzing battle reports realized that Canadian forces had achieved results far exceeding their relative size. German intelligence assessments captured by Allied forces revealed that the Wehrmacht considered Canadian units among the most dangerous opponents they faced. Soldiers from other Allied nations spoke openly about Canadian effectiveness in combat. Yet official recognition remained elusive. Montgomery continued to hoard credit for Allied successes. Alexander continued to favor British units when distributing resources and accolades. The pattern of disrespect persisted even as evidence of Canadian excellence mounted. This willful blindness reached its peak during a ceremony where Montgomery awarded medals for the Italian campaign. British units received numerous decorations for actions that Canadian units had actually performed. When a Canadian liaison officer politely pointed out the error, Montgomery dismissed him with a wave of his hand. The message was clear. In Montgomery's war, there was room for only one set of heroes, and they all spoke with British accents. But something had changed within the Canadian ranks. The anger and frustration that had driven them in the Gothic Line offensive was hardening into cold, calculated determination. They had proven they could outfight the Germans. Now they were going to prove they could do it again on an even larger scale. They were going to accumulate such an undeniable body count that no amount of British spin could erase their contribution. The stage was set for the final, bloodiest chapter of the Canadian-Italian campaign. And this time, the number of German casualties would be so staggering that the world would have to pay attention. Winter turned to spring. The Italian countryside bloomed with flowers that seemed obscene against the backdrop of war. But beneath the beauty, both sides prepared for renewed slaughter. The Germans had used the winter to strengthen their defenses. They had brought in fresh divisions, stockpiled ammunition, and fortified positions across northern Italy. They expected a major Allied offensive and were determined to make it as costly as possible. Canadian forces spent the winter training, planning, and preparing. They had learned hard lessons during the Gothic Line offensive. They had identified tactics that worked and discarded those that didn't. They had incorporated captured German weapons and equipment into their arsenal. They had developed new combined arms techniques that integrated infantry, armor, and artillery even more effectively. And they had recruited replacements for their casualties, bringing the units back up to strength. Most importantly, they had developed a killer instinct. These weren't the naive soldiers who had first arrived in Italy. These were hardened combat veterans who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. They had seen too many friends die, endured too many hardships, survived too many close calls. They had been forged in the fire of combat into the most lethal force Canada had ever put in the field. The spring offensive began in April 1945. By this point, the war was clearly nearing its end. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving into the heart of Germany. In Italy, the Germans were fighting a delaying action, trying to hold Allied forces in place while the Reich collapsed around them. But the Germans in northern Italy were still dangerous. They still had powerful defensive positions. They still had experienced troops who knew how to fight. They still had the capacity to inflict massive casualties on attacking forces. Kesselring and his successor, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, had no illusions about winning the war. But they could still make the Allies pay in blood for every kilometer of ground. The Canadian plan was ambitious to the point of recklessness. They would launch a massive assault across the Senio River, break through German defenses and drive toward the Po River Valley. Once across the Po, they would trap German forces against the Alps and annihilate them. The operation required perfect timing, flawless coordination, and a level of sustained combat effectiveness that few units could maintain. The Canadians pulled it off. And they did it with a savagery that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The opening barrage was unlike anything the Germans had experienced in Italy. Canadian artillery pounded German positions for hours, firing thousands of shells that pulverized fortifications and destroyed communications. When the barrage lifted, Canadian infantry and armor crossed the Senio River on prepositioned bridges, hitting German defenses before they could recover. This time there was no mercy. Canadian soldiers had endured too much, fought too hard, lost too many comrades. They killed German soldiers with a cold efficiency that terrified their enemies. Machine gunners cut down German troops trying to retreat. Tank crews crushed German positions under their treads. Flamethrower teams burned out bunkers, showing no quarter to defenders trying to surrender. This wasn't warfare. This was extermination. The brutality wasn't random or undisciplined. It was systematic and calculated. Canadian units had identified which German formations had committed atrocities against Canadian prisoners. They had noted which units had fought most fanatically, causing the highest Canadian casualties. Now they were exacting revenge with mathematical precision. Those units were targeted for destruction. Their soldiers were killed without hesitation. Their officers were hunted down specifically. German defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks collapsed in days. The Canadians pushed through one river line after another, maintaining offensive momentum that gave the Germans no time to regroup. Unit after unit of German soldiers found themselves cut off, surrounded, and destroyed. Some tried to surrender. Some fought to the death. All of them died or were captured by the tens of thousands. The Po River crossing was supposed to be the most difficult operation of the entire offensive. The Po was wide, fast-flowing, and heavily defended. German engineers had destroyed all the bridges. German artillery had pre-registered firing positions on likely crossing sites. German infantry had dug in along the far bank, ready to slaughter any force attempting to cross. The Canadians crossed in less than 24 hours. Engineers threw up pontoon bridges under fire. Infantry crossed in boats, assault craft, and anything that would float. Tanks followed as soon as the bridges could support their weight. Within a day, Canadian forces had established a bridgehead on the far side and were pushing deeper into the German rear. What followed was a pursuit and annihilation operation that ranks among the most one-sided battles in military history. German forces, caught between the Po River and the advancing Canadians, attempted to retreat toward the Alps. But Canadian armor moved faster. Canadian infantry appeared on roads the Germans thought were clear. Canadian artillery targeted retreating columns with devastating accuracy. Thousands of German soldiers died on those roads. Thousands more surrendered when they realized escape was impossible. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The German military structure in northern Italy didn't just collapse. It disintegrated. Officers lost contact with their units. Units lost contact with each other. Command and control broke down completely. What had been an organized military force became a mob of desperate men trying to survive. The Canadians showed no signs of letting up. If you're still watching, leave a comment and let us know what you think about this incredible story. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. Now, let's continue with the final phase of this unprecedented military achievement. As April turned to May, the scale of Canadian success became undeniable even to the most biased British observers. The body count was astronomical. Conservative estimates placed German casualties at over 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured by Canadian forces during the spring offensive. Some estimates went even higher. Entire German army corps had been destroyed. Equipment losses were staggering. The Germans had lost tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, and weapons in quantities that would have equipped several divisions. Canadian losses, while significant, were a fraction of the German casualties. The Canadians had achieved something almost unheard of in modern warfare. They had inflicted casualties on their enemy at a ratio of more than 10 to 1. This wasn't the grinding attrition that characterized much of World War II. This was a complete and utter defeat of German forces by a supposedly second-rate colonial army. The implications were profound. The Canadian offensive had effectively destroyed German military capability in northern Italy weeks before the official surrender. When Germany capitulated on May 7, 1945, German forces in Italy had already been defeated primarily by Canadian troops. The spring offensive had been the decisive action of the entire Italian campaign, and it had been overwhelmingly a Canadian achievement. Yet even in victory, the pattern of disrespect continued. When the surrender ceremony took place, British officers took prominent positions. When newspapers reported on the end of the Italian campaign, they focused on British and American commanders. When historians began writing the official accounts of the war, they marginalized Canadian contributions. The narrative that emerged was one of British-led Allied victory, with Canadians playing a supporting role. The soldiers who had actually done the fighting knew better. Canadian veterans returned home with few medals and less recognition, but with the knowledge that they had been among the finest combat forces of the entire war. They had fought against a determined enemy under difficult conditions with inadequate support from their supposed allies. They had overcome institutional prejudice, insufficient resources, and hostile terrain to achieve victories that military analysts still study today. The German perspective provides perhaps the most honest assessment. Captured German officers, when interviewed about their opponents, consistently rated Canadian forces among the most effective they faced. German soldiers who survived combat against the Canadians spoke of their aggression, their innovation, and their refusal to be stopped. German intelligence reports described Canadian units as extremely dangerous and recommended avoiding direct engagement whenever possible. These assessments stand in stark contrast to Montgomery's dismissive attitude and Alexander's institutional bias. The Germans, who had every reason to understand the quality of their opponents, recognized what British High Command refused to acknowledge: The Canadians were elite warriors who could match or exceed any unit in the war. But recognition from defeated enemies provided cold comfort to soldiers who felt betrayed by their supposed allies. Canadian veterans who had survived battles that killed 80,000 enemy soldiers came home to a country that barely knew they had been fighting. The Italian campaign was overshadowed by D-Day and the liberation of France. Canadian achievements were buried in the larger narrative of British and American victory. This historical injustice persisted for decades. Textbooks barely mentioned Canadian operations in Italy. Documentaries focused on Montgomery and Alexander while ignoring the men who actually did the fighting. The generation that had sacrificed so much gradually died off, taking their stories with them. The 80,000 German casualties became a footnote if they were mentioned at all. But the truth remains, preserved in military records, official documents, and the fading memories of those who were there. The Canadian First Corps in Italy achieved military success on a scale that few units in any war have ever matched. They did it while being systematically undermined by their own commanders. They did it with inferior equipment and inadequate support. They did it through ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination. The improvised weapons and modified equipment that Canadian soldiers created weren't just clever innovations. They were symbols of a larger truth. When institutions fail you, when leaders dismiss you, when the system seems designed to hold you back, you find a way forward anyway. Canadian soldiers in Italy couldn't count on Montgomery to give them proper support. They couldn't count on Alexander to recognize their achievements. So they counted on each other and proved that dedication and skill can overcome institutional prejudice. The tactical innovations Canadians developed in Italy influenced military doctrine for decades afterward. The combined arms techniques they perfected became standard practice in modern armies. The emphasis on speed and aggression in offensive operations became a hallmark of effective military thinking. The willingness to improvise and adapt rather than rigidly following doctrine became recognized as essential to success in fluid combat situations. Yet the soldiers who developed these innovations rarely received credit for their intellectual contributions. Military historians attributed advances in tactical thinking to various British and American theorists. The practical lessons learned by Canadian forces in Italy were adopted without acknowledgement of their source. Once again, the Canadians did the work while others took the credit. This pattern of appropriation and dismissal reveals something disturbing about institutional memory and historical narrative. Success is often attributed to those with power and prestige rather than those who actually achieved it. The dominant narrative reflects the perspective of elites rather than the reality of ground-level experience. Truth becomes less important than maintaining comfortable fictions about who deserves credit and recognition. For the German soldiers who faced Canadian forces in Italy, there was no ambiguity. They knew who had defeated them. They knew which units had shattered their defenses, overrun their positions, and killed their comrades by the tens of thousands. The 80,000 casualties weren't an abstract statistic. They were real men who died because they underestimated an enemy they had been told was inferior. That underestimation was a fatal mistake. Canadian soldiers might have been dismissed by their own commanders, but they were utterly lethal on the battlefield. Their kill count spoke louder than any propaganda or official history. 80,000 German casualties represented roughly the equivalent of 8 full-strength divisions. The Canadians had effectively destroyed an entire German army corps through superior fighting skill, innovative tactics, and relentless aggression. The psychological impact on German forces was almost as significant as the physical casualties. German units transferred to face the Canadians experienced plummeting morale. Officers struggled to maintain discipline when soldiers believed they were being sent to certain death. The reputation Canadians earned as ruthlessly effective killers preceded them, undermining German combat effectiveness before fighting even began. This psychological warfare aspect of Canadian operations deserves more recognition than it has received. The Canadians weren't just militarily effective. They were terrifying. German prisoners described facing Canadian assaults as nightmarish experiences where well-coordinated attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, leaving defenders no time to react and no clear line of retreat. The combination of tactical sophistication and aggressive execution created a form of combat that German defenders found almost impossible to counter. The brutality wasn't sadistic or undisciplined. It was strategic. Canadian forces had learned that showing mercy to a determined enemy could be tactically counterproductive. By prosecuting their attacks with maximum force and minimal hesitation, they reduced their own casualties while maximizing the psychological impact on German forces. It was cold, calculated warfare designed to break the enemy's will to fight. And it worked. By the end of the Italian campaign, German units facing Canadian forces surrendered more readily than those facing other Allied forces. The reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded Canadian units, creating opportunities for quick victories that reduced casualties on both sides. Fear became a weapon as effective as artillery or armor. This effectiveness came at a cost, though. Canadian soldiers who participated in the Italian campaign carried psychological scars that never fully healed. They had seen and done things that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The burden of killing 80,000 enemy soldiers, even in a just war, left marks that no amount of counseling or support could fully erase. Victory in combat doesn't erase the trauma of violence, no matter how justified that violence might be. The veterans who returned home struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. They had experienced things that their families and friends couldn't understand. They had developed skills and perspectives that had no place in peacetime. They had formed bonds with their comrades that no civilian relationship could replicate. Many felt isolated and disconnected, carrying their wartime experiences as burdens they could never fully share. These psychological costs were compounded by the lack of recognition. It's one thing to suffer trauma in service of a cause that's acknowledged and celebrated. It's quite another to sacrifice your mental health for achievements that history largely ignores. Canadian veterans of the Italian campaign faced both the trauma of combat and the frustration of seeing their contributions dismissed or forgotten. Some found solace in veterans' organizations where they could share their experiences with others who understood. Some channeled their experiences into advocacy, pushing for better treatment of veterans and more accurate historical accounting. Some simply endured, carrying their memories in silence until death finally brought release. All of them deserved better than they received from a society that benefited from their sacrifice but failed to properly acknowledge it. The families of those who didn't come home faced their own struggles. Letters arrived informing them that their sons, husbands, brothers, or fathers had been killed in action in Italy. But those letters rarely provided context about what those men had accomplished. The families knew their loved ones had died fighting, but they often didn't know that they had been part of one of the most successful military operations of the entire war. Imagine receiving notification that your son died fighting in Italy, then picking up a newspaper and reading about how British forces were winning the campaign. Imagine attending a memorial service where the focus was on British commanders and British achievements while your son's Canadian unit was barely mentioned. Imagine the bitter knowledge that your loved one died doing something historically significant, but history was already forgetting his contribution. This erasure wasn't just an insult to the dead. It was a betrayal of the living. Families deserved to know that their sacrifice had meaning, that their loved ones had died achieving something remarkable. Instead, they were offered vague platitudes about service and duty while the specific reality of Canadian achievement was buried beneath British propaganda. The irony is profound. Montgomery and Alexander, the commanders who dismissed and insulted the Canadians, are remembered as great military leaders. Their strategic decisions are studied in military academies. Their careers are documented in numerous biographies and histories. Meanwhile, the Canadian soldiers who actually won the battles those commanders claimed credit for remain largely anonymous. This inversion of credit and recognition reveals the power dynamics that shape historical memory. Those who control the narrative control how events are remembered. Those with institutional power can shape perceptions in ways that benefit themselves at the expense of truth. The Canadian experience in Italy demonstrates how easily genuine achievement can be erased when it doesn't fit the preferred narrative of those in power. But the facts remain, buried in military archives and official records. The casualty figures don't lie. The battle reports, despite their often dismissive tone toward Canadian contributions, document what actually happened. The German records, captured after the war, provide independent verification of Canadian effectiveness. The truth exists, even if it's been deliberately obscured. 80,000 German casualties. That's not a number that can be explained away or attributed to someone else. That's a body count that represents one of the most successful sustained military operations of World War II. And it was achieved primarily by Canadian forces who were consistently undermined by their own commanders. Think about what that means. Without proper support, without adequate resources, without recognition or respect, Canadian soldiers killed or captured the equivalent of an entire German army corps. They did this while being treated as second-class troops by the very commanders who should have been championing their cause. They achieved this through innovation, determination, and a refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. This achievement demands recognition. It demands that we question official narratives and challenge historical accounts that don't align with documented facts. It demands that we honor the men who did the fighting rather than the commanders who took the credit. It demands that we tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for those who benefit from its concealment. Before we wrap up this incredible story, make sure you've subscribed to this channel. We bring you the forgotten stories of World War II, the accounts that challenge official narratives and reveal uncomfortable truths. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Did you know about the Canadian contribution to the Italian campaign? Does this story change how you think about World War II? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. The legacy of the Canadian-Italian campaign extends beyond the immediate military impact. It represents a broader pattern where colonial and Commonwealth forces made enormous contributions to Allied victory while receiving minimal recognition. Australian forces in the Pacific, Indian forces in Burma, New Zealand forces across multiple theaters, all faced similar patterns of dismissal from British commanders and erasure from popular historical narratives. This pattern reflects deeper prejudices about race, nationality, and empire that persisted even as those empires were beginning to crumble. British commanders like Montgomery and Alexander operated within an intellectual framework that assumed British superiority. They couldn't acknowledge Canadian excellence without challenging that fundamental assumption. So they denied the evidence in front of them, attributing success to British leadership while blaming failures on colonial inadequacy. The Canadian soldiers fighting in Italy understood this dynamic. They saw how British units received credit for Canadian achievements. They watched British commanders ignore their suggestions while implementing the same ideas later and claiming them as original British innovations. They endured the insults and dismissals while continuing to fight and die for a cause that should have been shared but was treated as exclusively British. Their response wasn't to give up or reduce their effectiveness. It was to fight even harder, to achieve even more, to make their accomplishments so undeniable that even Montgomery couldn't ignore them. The 80,000 German casualties represent not just military success but a form of protest. Every German soldier killed or captured was proof that the Canadians deserved better than they were receiving. This determination to prove themselves through action rather than words characterized the Canadian approach throughout the war. They let their battlefield performance speak for them. They focused on tactical excellence rather than political maneuvering. They built their reputation through deeds rather than propaganda. And they achieved results that should have silenced their critics forever. The fact that those critics continued dismissing Canadian contributions even in the face of overwhelming evidence reveals how deeply rooted institutional prejudice can be. Montgomery's biases weren't based on evidence or performance. They were based on assumptions about British superiority that no amount of contradictory evidence could shake. This kind of willful blindness is dangerous in any context but particularly so in warfare where lives depend on accurate assessment of capabilities and limitations. How many Canadian soldiers died because Montgomery refused to properly support their operations? How many opportunities were missed because Alexander wouldn't exploit Canadian success? How many German soldiers survived to fight another day because British commanders wouldn't reinforce Canadian breakthroughs? These questions have no definitive answers, but the implications are sobering. Institutional prejudice isn't just insulting. It's deadly. When commanders make decisions based on bias rather than evidence, people die unnecessarily. The Canadian experience in Italy illustrates this principle with brutal clarity. Better command decisions based on honest assessment of Canadian capabilities could have shortened the campaign, reduced casualties, and possibly even changed the strategic balance of the entire war. But those decisions weren't made. The Canadians fought with one hand tied behind their backs, achieving remarkable success despite institutional obstacles that should have been supporting them. Their achievement is all the more impressive because it was accomplished in such an hostile environment. The question that haunts this story is, what could they have accomplished with proper support? If Montgomery had given them the resources they deserved, if Alexander had recognized their capabilities, if British High Command had treated them as equals rather than colonials, what might the Canadians have achieved? We'll never know. But we can extrapolate from what they did accomplish. If 80,000 German casualties represent what they achieved while being undermined, imagine what they could have done with full support. They might have ended the Italian campaign months earlier. They might have trapped and destroyed even larger German forces. They might have freed up Allied troops for use in other theaters, potentially shortening the war. Instead, their potential was artificially limited by commanders more concerned with maintaining imperial hierarchy than winning battles efficiently. This represents one of the great missed opportunities of World War II, a force that could have achieved even more than it did, held back by prejudice and institutional blindness. The soldiers who survived the Italian campaign carried this knowledge with them. They knew what they had accomplished. They knew what they could have accomplished with better support. That knowledge bred a cynicism about military and political authority that persisted throughout their lives. They had learned the hard way that doing your duty doesn't guarantee recognition, that excellence doesn't automatically overcome prejudice, that the powerful will rewrite history to suit their preferences regardless of truth. This cynicism was earned. These weren't men who had failed and were making excuses. These were men who had succeeded brilliantly despite institutional sabotage. They had every right to be angry about how they were treated. They had every right to demand that their contributions be properly acknowledged. And they had every right to be disappointed when that acknowledgement never fully came. As the years passed and veterans grew old, some tried to tell their stories. They gave interviews to local newspapers. They spoke at schools about their experiences. They wrote memoirs that small publishers released in limited editions. But their voices were drowned out by the dominant narrative of British-led Allied victory. The comfortable myth proved more appealing than the uncomfortable truth. Now most of those veterans are gone. The generation that fought in Italy has largely passed away. Their first-hand accounts have been lost. The living memory of those battles has faded. All that remains are documents, records, and the fading testimony of those few survivors still with us. That's why stories like this matter. That's why we need to challenge official narratives and examine the historical record with skeptical eyes. The truth about the Canadian-Italian campaign exists, but it requires effort to uncover. It requires questioning authority and rejecting comfortable assumptions. It requires acknowledging that popular history often obscures as much as it reveals. The 80,000 German casualties aren't going to be forgotten. They happened. They're documented. The question is whether we're going to accurately attribute responsibility for those casualties or whether we're going to continue perpetuating myths about British military brilliance that ignore the actual soldiers who did the fighting. This channel is dedicated to getting the story right. We dig into the archives. We examine the evidence. We challenge the narratives that don't hold up under scrutiny. And we give voice to those who were silenced by official history. That's our mission. That's why we do this work. And that's why your support matters. So once again, please subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with anyone interested in military history or World War II. Leave a comment telling us what other forgotten stories you'd like to hear. Your engagement helps us continue this important work of recovering historical truth from beneath layers of propaganda and institutional bias. The Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their achievements recognized. They deserve to be acknowledged as the elite warriors they were. Not second-class troops. Not colonial auxiliaries. Not supporting players in someone else's story. They were the main event. They were the ones who killed 80,000 enemy soldiers. They were the ones who broke the Gothic line. They were the ones who destroyed German military capability in northern Italy. Montgomery insulted them. Alexander ignored them. History has largely forgotten them. But the evidence remains. The body count doesn't lie. The records document what happened even if popular narratives obscure it. And now, through channels like this, the truth is finally being told. This story matters because it reveals uncomfortable truths about how history is written and who gets credit for victories. It matters because it challenges us to question official narratives and examine evidence ourselves. It matters because it honors men who deserved better than they received. And it matters because the pattern it reveals, colonial forces making disproportionate contributions while receiving minimal recognition, extends far beyond the Canadian experience in Italy. Every forgotten soldier, every dismissed achievement, every erased contribution represents a theft of historical memory. When we allow powerful institutions to control the narrative, we lose the truth. When we accept official accounts without skepticism, we perpetuate injustice. When we forget the men who actually fought and died, we dishonor their sacrifice. The Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy didn't do it for glory or recognition. They did it because their country called and duty demanded. They did it for their comrades, for each other, for the bonds forged in combat. They did it because someone had to stop the Nazis and they were willing to pay the price. They paid that price. Thousands of Canadian soldiers died in Italy. Thousands more were wounded, some carrying injuries for the rest of their lives. All of them sacrificed their youth, their innocence, and often their mental health. They did this willingly, asking only that their contribution be acknowledged. That acknowledgement was denied. Not by the enemy who recognized Canadian effectiveness all too well. Not by fellow soldiers who saw their courage and skill firsthand. But by the commanders who should have championed them and the historians who should have documented their achievements accurately. This is the final insult. To fight brilliantly, to sacrifice enormously, to achieve extraordinary success, and then to be forgotten. To have your accomplishments attributed to others. To have your story erased. To become a footnote in someone else's narrative. But we remember. This channel remembers. And everyone watching this video now knows the truth. Canadian soldiers, armed with aging tanks and improvised weapons, systematically destroyed German military capability in northern Italy. They killed or captured 80,000 enemy soldiers. They broke supposedly impregnable defensive lines. They prosecuted one of the most successful military operations of World War II. They did this despite institutional prejudice. They did this despite inadequate support. They did this despite being insulted by Montgomery and ignored by Alexander. They did this through courage, innovation, and determination. They did this because they were among the finest soldiers any nation has ever produced. Their story deserves to be told. Their achievements deserve to be acknowledged. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored. And their example deserves to inspire us all. Thank you for watching. Thank you for learning this forgotten chapter of history. Thank you for helping us ensure these men are not forgotten. Please subscribe, please comment, and please share this video. The more people who know this story, the harder it becomes for history to continue ignoring it. Together, we can make sure the Canadian soldiers who fought in Italy finally receive the recognition they always deserved.